So Denver, Colorado, graduated from seminary. If you've ever been in the Rockies, you know the beauty of the Rockies and how nice a place to live in Denver is. And I got a call to be the pastor of a church in Manchester, Massachusetts. When anybody says Manchester in reference to New England, they almost automatically think of New Hampshire. But there's a Manchester in just about every New England state. This one is Manchester by the Sea. It is a small town, about 7,000 people. It's actually a bedroom community for many of the professionals who commute down to Boston to work either in Boston or in the Boston area. It's also it was also in the early 1900s and the late 1800s a choice vacation spot for some of the ultra wealthy of New England. So in Manchester, Massachusetts, you have not a three-tiered society, but elements of three different tiers of society. There is a blue-collar lobster fisherman community, because Manchester is a seaport and a fishing community. It's very close to Gloucester. It's between Boston and Gloucester, Massachusetts. And then there are these professional people who work in Boston. And then there are some ultra rich who have very large mansions on the coast in Manchester, Massachusetts. Manchester First Baptist Church called me to be their pastor, and I served there for just over 9 years. I left in 1984 to come to a church in California, but that's a different story. When we moved to Manchester, Elizabeth, our daughter, was about, not quite 2, but 1.5, and my wife Elaine and myself, and we moved into the church parsonage. It was about 8 blocks up the street on Stool Street from the church. The church is a typical New England church where you have Sunday school rooms downstairs on the ground level, and then you climb a flight of stairs and you get into the sanctuary. And it's a church of about 100 people, maybe slightly more, give or take. Over the course of the 9 years that I was there, we experienced some tremendous growth. At one point, we were up to 325 people, which for a New England church is a fairly good-sized church. We had two services every Sunday. Manchester is located fairly close to Gordon College in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts. So a number of students used had our church as their home church away from home. And we just had a really good time for those 9 years. There were, as there are in every pastorate, some people who like you, and there are some people who don't like you, and then you try to minister to all of them. I enjoyed, had a tremendous music minister that came and was our worship leader. Her name was Tony. She and her husband was going to seminary at Gordon Conwell Seminary. Had another fellow by the name of Jeff who was my assistant pastor, and enjoyed working with him for a number of years. Had some very interesting people, a fellow by the name of Condon McDonough, who was a scientist, worked for TRW, brilliant-minded person. His best friend was a retired fisherman/farmer named Harry, who had no education beyond the 6th grade, but they were just this incredible sort of Mutt and Jeff. Condon is 6'5", and Harry was maybe 5'9" at the most. But just really interesting people. Great community. One of the neat things about Manchester is it's small enough to not be able to support all of the, you know, the police department, for example, was only 7 patrolmen. The fire department had 9 firemen. And so one of the highlights for me in Manchester was I was part of the volunteer fire department as well. So I was a volunteer fireman for 7 years, and there are a number of stories that come out of that. But I think the main thing about, for as far as my family was concerned, the main thing about Manchester is that's where our family grew from 3, Elaine, myself, and our daughter Elizabeth, to 6. In the space of about a year and a half to 2 years, Elizabeth went from being a single child to having 6 brothers and sisters. My wife and I, the parsonage was a fairly large house, had 5 bedrooms. We had all kinds of love. We weren't able to get pregnant. And so we had some friends back in Wisconsin who had been foster parents. And so we became foster parents to a number of foster children, not teenagers, but children in Manchester. We had a total of 7 foster children. 4 of them lived with us for a very long time, for a number of years, and ultimately we adopted 3 of those children. Their names are Jonathan, who goes by Lucky, his younger brother Brennan, and his younger sister Heather. They came to us through the foster system. Jonathan, Lucky, came to us first by himself. We had another foster son by the name of Roy who had lived with us prior to John's coming for a number of years. But when Lucky showed up, he was with us as a kindergartner, and he lived with us. We were one time walking through a tourist community called Rockport, Massachusetts. John, Lucky, is on my shoulder. I need to call him Lucky because that's what he has chosen to go by now. Lucky is on my shoulder, and all of a sudden he says, "Dad, there's my brother and sister." We had no idea that he had either brother or sister at the time. And I looked at him. I can remember he was riding on my shoulders. He had had an ice cream cone and had chocolate ice cream, and he had dripped some chocolate ice cream on my head. And I was in the process of trying to rub that ice cream off of my hair. At that time I had an afro. You couldn't imagine it now. But out of my hair. And he said, "No, that's really my younger brother, my younger brother Brennan, and his sister Heather." So we went up to the people. They were with an elderly couple, and we said, our little boy says that these 2 are his brother and sister. And they said, "Yeah, that's true." The brother and sister, the 3 of them had been in foster care, and it had proven necessary for them to be taken away from their mother at that time for a whole nother series of stories that I will let them tell should they ever decide they want to tell those stories. But the 2 younger ones had been placed for fostering in the home of the couple, an elderly couple, and then Lucky had been placed in our home. They were separated, but we had periodic contact with the fostering parents for about a year. And then the fostering parents realized that at their age, they were elderly, they were themselves grandparents, not grandparents to these children, but other grandparents. So they were up into their late 60s, early 70s. And they realized that they could not take care in an effective way, in an ongoing way for Brennan and Heather. And so they, through the foster system, came and asked us, would we be willing to foster all 3 of the kids, and that way the siblings could be united again. Well, we said we were. At that point, we had already started adoption proceedings with the foster system for Lucky, and ultimately we were able to adopt him when he, at the age of 7, when he was 7. And since we were adopting him, we petitioned the state for permission to adopt his brother and sister in order to keep them together as siblings as well, and we were given permission. And so about another year to a year and a half later, I believe that Brennan at that point was around 5, he may have been 4, and Heather was 2. We adopted them as well. So then in our family, we now have 4 children. We have Lucky, who currently is a father and a profession. I've talked briefly about them earlier. Our biological child, Elizabeth, with her family of 2 children and her husband. Brennan and his new wife, Clarissa, in Maryland, and Heather and her 3 children, and her current friend who live in mid-California. So the important thing about Manchester is this coming together then, the blessing of having a family of 4 children, and Elaine and myself. And at the end of our time there, we were contacted by a church now from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, by a church in Palos Verdes. I sat my children down at the table to tell them that we were going to be moving from coast to coast. I told them that it was going to be an adventure. They had a little bit of a different opinion, but over the course of time, and very, very quickly, they adapted to the new life in California, and we have now been there, here in California, in various places since 1984. But that's another story.